Good morning, good evening, good afternoon for those of you all around the world. Welcome. This session is about greening inclusive finance. I'm Mayada El-Zogby. I'm the Managing Director of the Center for Financial Inclusion. This session is taking place at the same time as COP26, the UN Climate Change Conference, taking place in Glasgow, Scotland. So it's not a surprise to anyone here that climate change is perhaps the greatest risk that we're all facing. We're all either directly experiencing it or we're observing storms, floods, heat waves, other natural disasters that have affected developed and developing countries alike. So none of us are immune to this situation. 190 world leaders are meeting in Glasgow this week, and we've heard many promising commitments and announcements. But do these high-level commitments reach low-income people? That's the question I have today. Most of the global attention on climate change is about mitigation, which is about reducing greenhouse gases. Low-income countries and low-income people are not the main contributors to greenhouse gases, but they are more likely to get impacted. And then what does this impact actually look like? It takes many forms. I think first and foremost, as I mentioned, it takes the form of a lot of natural disasters that affect their lives. It also means very traditional livelihoods, particularly farming, may no longer be sustainable without significant changes in investments. All of these impacts on people's lives and livelihoods require them to make both short-term and long-term expenditures. And how is that paid for? And that's what this session here is about. We'll be talking about why the environment matters for low-income people, why financial institutions, including microfinance institutions, need to care about this for themselves as well as their customers, and what they can do about it. And we'll also be talking about how regulators and policymakers are thinking about this issue at the broader financial system level. I know it's a complex subject, so I'm very honored today that I have three phenomenal panelists, one of whom is a climate scientist. So I will kick us off by asking you, the audience, with asking you not to look at the bios, not to run off to the bio section, and instead tell us who you think is the climate scientist on the panel. Is it me? Is it Callum Scott? Is it Justice Njeru? Is it Johanna Nyman? Or is it none of us? So take a minute to respond on the poll, and then I'll introduce the panel. I'll go ahead and just get started and introduce and see what you guys guess. Callum Scott is an expert in impact and microfinance. He works at Opportunity International. He leads Opportunity's program to implement social performance across a network of their partners. And he also leads Opportunity's climate resilience strategy. Justice Njeru works for MSC Consulting, which is formerly Microsave. Justice is the practice global leader in MSC Anglophone Africa. He's a market systems thinker, and he is an expert in value chains. He's done a lot of work in various subjects, very related to our topic of today: agribusiness, renewable energy, microfinance, wash sectors. He manages a lot of the field work, designing research, as well as work with providers. And then Johanna Nyman works for AFI, the Alliance for Financial Inclusion. All right, I'm seeing the results, and wow. So about half of you guessed Johanna, and you are right. The other half guessed Justice, and not so right. But he does have a lot of the skills we're looking for today. So it's great to have them both on the panel. So I'm going to go back to Johanna. Johanna is head of inclusive green finance at AFI. AFI, of course, is the global network of policymakers and regulators working on inclusive finance. She supports AFI's working group on inclusive green finance, which includes 49 members. She worked on global climate policy, green finance, and climate security in the European Union before going to AFI. And she is our environmental scientist. So welcome, Joanna. So you'll notice that we called this session Greening Inclusive Finance. So we chose to call it we didn't choose to call it inclusive green finance. And maybe this is being a little bit nitpicky, but we thought, who are we talking to? We want to talk to the inclusive finance audience. And what we want is we want this audience to think about what it takes to be more green or more climate conscious. And that's why we called it greening inclusive finance. We might have other thoughts on this issue later in the debate, later in the discussion, and we'll get to that later. All right, just to situate everyone, and calibrate for the panelists, we wanted to get a sense of people's knowledge around green inclusive finance. How would you rate your knowledge? Are you very knowledgeable? Are you somewhat knowledgeable? Do you have limited knowledge, or not at all? Or maybe you don't know, or you don't want to say. Take a minute to vote. And as you vote, I want to go ahead and start getting Callum ready for his intervention. Callum, I know Opportunity International works with a lot of partners around the world, and I know that this is a topic that is of deep interest to your network. You've been doing some research in Rwanda to understand climate risks that farmers have been experiencing. Could you tell us a little bit more about what you found, and just give a little bit of background on that research that you've been doing in Rwanda?
Absolutely. Thanks, Mayada, and I'm very grateful to have the chance to be part of this session. Now, you can clearly all tell I'm not a scientist. I'm actually an economist by background, and I'm the climate strategy lead for Opportunity International. And as a network, we're on a journey to develop an effective climate strategy for Opportunity. We've been in the business of expanding access to affordable finance for more than 40 years, but we're now regularly seeing climate change impacting our partners, impacting their portfolios and their clients. And the research in Rwanda is part of our response to that. And the key questions for that research were, what are the impacts, both environmental and socioeconomic, of climate change on the clients of our partner, Urwego Bank in Rwanda? How are the partners' existing products and services building the resilience of the clients and their communities? Who are excluded from those benefits? And what needs are currently not being met? And we were also keen to understand, what we could learn from that research that we could apply more broadly across our network and potentially across the microfinance sector. So the research has been carried out over the last several months this year by Microsave and Glasgow Caledonian University. And you'll hear from Justice from Microsave shortly. But through the research, we surveyed 300 smallholder farmers and other types of clients in 4 districts of Rwanda, and interviewed around 60 key stakeholders to try to answer those questions. Now, the research is actually still ongoing, but I can share a few of the preliminary results and how we think we can act on those findings. So the most frequent impacts on the environment and the livelihoods of the clients were that nearly all of the research participants mentioned either drought or intense sunshine, as well as heavy rain and flooding that affected their livelihoods. And these really very different climate events resulted in substantial losses to the harvest of the clients. Socioeconomic impacts were that food security, or food insecurity rather, was mentioned very frequently. Health impacts, including child malnutrition, and households being unable to afford children's education and other essentials. And the financial services provided by our partner were helping clients to increase productivity. So, for example, through purchasing seeds and fertilizer, enabling investment in equipment and land improvement, but the existing design of financial services also limited their use to build resilience. For example, many farmers couldn't get loans for some urgent needs, so paying workers for planting crops or harvesting. And an even greater limitation was that if farmers weren't members of cooperatives, then they weren't able to access financial services. And that's particularly concerning, because that means those farmers were doubly excluded or doubly vulnerable in the event of climate impacts, because they didn't have the support of cooperatives and they couldn't access the financial services that were needed. So the research, as I say, is still underway, but our preliminary conclusions are certainly that within the communities we looked at, those who are most vulnerable to climate impacts also appear to face the highest barriers to accessing financial services, even though those services would be helpful to them in terms of mitigating climate impacts. And for us, there's plenty of scope to do further research to understand how we can assist our financial inclusion partners in terms of building resilience in those clients.
So thank you so much for sharing this research. So it sounds like microfinance institutions have not yet done enough to really address the needs of at least this particular group, which is farmers. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, certainly in Rwanda, where we've done the research, that would be the case. We're looking to repeat the research in other countries where we're working, including India, but also the reading that we've done, the desk research that we've done, does suggest that there's lots of potential to increase understanding of climate risks, how they affect both organizations and clients. And to my mind, that's unfortunate, because the microfinance platform does offer, it does offer this way of accessing remote and rural vulnerable people to help with climate adaptation. And I think it's really important that we explore that potential.
Great, thank you, Callum. I just wanted to add a few other data points. So Callum just spoke about farmers. We've been doing some research with micro and small enterprises. So these are primarily urban business owners. And we have actually found in our data, we've been collecting data every 2 months in a series of countries. And we found that those who have experienced a prior climate shock had significantly had problems at recovering from the pandemic. So their savings had been depleted, and they were more likely to have more debt. So it's not just a farmer or smallholder problem. It's also affects urban businesses. But this issue around microfinance institutions or financial services providers more generally and their preparedness, this is something that Justice knows something about. So I want to turn to you next. MSC has been doing quite a lot of work on this topic in several countries in sub-Saharan Africa. I know most recently you've been working with Opportunity International as a partner in Rwanda, but I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about what you're finding as you've been working with different providers across sub-Saharan Africa.
Thanks, Mayada, and it's really a great pleasure being in the panel today to contribute to this debate and also to share the lessons that MSC has learned over years. Let me begin by saying that MSC is a global consulting company that enables social, financial, economic inclusion in the digital age. So our operation, the way we operate, we do support strategic advice to programs and insights through field-based approaches, where we understand the client and their needs, perception, aspiration, and behavior, and then we help build solutions that work for them. So regarding the climate-related issue, as you rightly mentioned, we've worked with several institutions in sub-Saharan Africa in different countries. And as you rightly mentioned, the recent one being our work with the Opportunity International in Rwanda, together with the Glasgow Caledonian University. And what some of the lessons that we've picked is that, yes, like what Callum has rightly mentioned towards the end, is that there's still some institutions, especially microfinance, still are within the journey. They still have a lot to do so that they can provide the right solution to the customer. But overall, what we are seeing, there are two main approaches that the institutions, the financial service providers, are applying. One being the intentional approaches, and the other being unintentional approaches. There are some, of course, there are steps. We can't, of course, generalize and say that there's not much that the institutions are doing so far. There's a lot of steps that we've done if you look back 5-10 years backwards and today. So if I look at the institutions that are already very quote unquote green intentional, these are institutions where they're being led from the top, where we are seeing the directors, the board coming up and defining strategies and policy through what they call the triple bottom line approach, where they are looking at the triple P. We are looking at the profit, people, and planet. And the issues of planet being, how can we ensure that in every solution that we offer our customer, then it's in line with the conservation of our environment. The other things that we've seen where their institutions are intentional, they start developing tools and approaches. And some of the tools that we've seen is like the credit facilities or savings solutions. One being maybe to farmers, to ensure that the farmers can afford the right seeds, the right inputs at the right time, ensuring that the income is smoothened even when there are periods when they don't have, they have been hit by these climate-related disasters. Also ensuring that they promote clean energy products. We have seen a lot of institutions now introducing that as a line of financing, where it's either lighting or cooking solutions. And I'll also talk about the downside of what of introducing these lines where the institutions are not intentional, or they are not doing it intentionally through a laid down procedure or process. And then the other things are to ensure that also they do a lot of partnerships because they are very intentional in ensuring that they are greening their operation. And some of the partnerships that we've seen is building the partnerships through the local government because of their close relationship. And microfinance plays a critical role, especially in the sub-Saharan Africa. At least most of the people, they are able to access finance through the microfinance. So we have seen things like the national insurance schemes that are introduced by government, and the first people to be brought on board initially would be commercial banks, but over time we are seeing also interest with the microfinance institution after understanding that most commercial banks might not be able to reach the very remote people or the rural community. Then microfinance institutions are brought on board to participate in those schemes. Also, the other things we've also seen intentionally for institutions is to ensure that they align themselves with the service provider of auxiliary services like trainings, to ensure that their customer understand about climate change, they understand the impact of climate change, what would be the mitigation measures, and so on. Also aligning themselves with some supply chain companies who of course adhere to the NDPE policy of no deforestation, no piracy, and no exploitation as well. So we have seen a lot of institutions working closely with them to ensure that when they are financing, the end customer does not end up contributing to the green gas, or ensuring that overall is to ensure that the customer does decarbonation. Then the other partnerships we've seen in institution is aligning with the same, either through institutions, public institutions, or digital platforms that offer agronomic advisories. This to do with the early warning systems in some countries. The other being weather forecasting to ensure that the customers are able to receive information well in advance and prepare for their seasons, especially the farmers that were mentioned by Callum while he was presenting. Land use management, land use preparation, and as well as soil mapping, which is important for especially the rural clientele or the farmers to ensure that they know what type of fertilizer they should use so that they can still maintain the health of the soils and ensure that the produce they are going to produce does not end up harming the environment. So other things we've seen, because the institution is quite intentional, is aligning themselves with the social safety nets. And this is some of the G2P programs that are run either by development agencies or through the government to ensure that part of their customers, they align to it in case of these calamities, then at least they have a fallback plans, things like smart subsidies, hunger safety net, where they appear. So we are seeing a lot of institutions now becoming very conscious. But as I said, this has to be driven from top. And what we are seeing, they are integrating into their policy, developing systems and ensuring that when they have risk management frameworks, then they include climate-related risk as part of what they observe over time, and they also develop these mitigation measures as I've mentioned. On the other hand, we have approaches which are very unintentional. These are approaches which also cause, of course, they have an impact on the end customers, but if you look at the institutions themselves, and this is where we feel most of the institutions currently are, they haven't integrated them. They are not pushed by the board, not the management. Their systems, they are not aligned with these interventions. But these are things that are pushed by either government, donors, or development agencies, probably through a project setup, where they come up with a project probably to support rural customer in certain region in a country, or even a certain district within the country. But the issue, but then it's channeled through a microfinance institution or a rural financial institution. So if you look at it, it's a positive thing because finally the customer get to get the mitigation tools. However, from the supply side or the financial service provider, it is not something that was pre-planned or designed within the institution. Also, we have seen also push by the private sector providers, where the developers of climate smart solutions, especially like if we talk about energy saving cooking stoves or clean energy lighting solutions, they would like to reach the rural customer, and they know the microfinance is one channel that they can easily reach the very rural people. So they would come, package a solution within the institution, and then the customers of that institution can access this product. Now, the downside of that, what we have seen is sometimes it's end up being the product not moving as fast as it would have done, simply because internally there's lack of capacity, first of all, for the institution to appreciate why these products are being channeled through the institution. And secondly, the customers themselves, they are not really, they don't have the relevant knowledge about this solution, and as well as the processes that has to be undertaken. So as a result, you'll find some institutions end up having a lot of default in these products, not being paid well. Or we have a situation where we have seen institutions turning their branches to be a supply chain office, where we have stocks and stocks of cooking stuff, but they are not moving. To the level where at some point we have seen in some country where the regulator had to come and say, your work is not to do merchandise. You should focus on financial service provision. So there are all those challenges, but we feel that the microfinance, especially the rural financial service provider, especially the microfinance, is still the channel that, with the relevant support from through policy and regulators, it can be a very good channel to ensure that these solutions reach out to the very poor, as you rightly mentioned, it being the farmers, the SMEs, and anybody else that they reach out to.
Thank you, Justice. This was a packed full of information, super interesting. I have a follow-up question I want you to think about, and then I'm gonna, while you think about it, I'm also gonna just do a poll. But clearly, this is not just about a product. Like everything that you've talked about is a pretty big institutional change required to do this in a comprehensive way. What does it take to actually get an institution to go from unintentional to intentional? So just think about that for a second, and then I just want to pose a poll to the audience. So first, I want to summarize the result of the first poll, which is basically the majority of the audience feels that they have limited knowledge. So hopefully this session is helpful to you. The next poll, though, I wanted to ask you about how prepared you think your FSP, if you're a financial service provider, or if you're working with partners that are financial services providers, what is your impression of their preparedness to understand and manage climate risks? So take some time to answer that, while Justice, I turn to you around this intentionality issue. What does it take? Who needs to nudge?
Sure, thanks. So as I rightly mentioned, this is something that has to come from the top of the institution. Then is, of course, is trickled down to the ranks and files of the institution. But how does it happen? Then what we have seen, the main issue with the institution is lack of capacity. So there is a limited capacity within the institution. Just to understand, first of all, the issues, like you can see in the poll, even the people attending already, 3/4 already have very limited or no knowledge about climate issues. So it's the same case with the microfinance institution or the rural financial institutions. There's very limited appreciation of the climate issues. What is the impact? How does it even impact our portfolio? And then how can we then develop measures that really work? The second thing is even when there is how then can we ensure that there is the relevant knowledge? So this is where, I mean, people, and I think like now what Callum are doing, Opportunity International, trying to gather through research grounded evidence that can then be put together into a toolkit. Then that toolkit can be used to train the institutions. Over time, they can start appreciating the importance of being ready, preparing for an eventuality, understanding what are the risks that our customers face, and how do we ensure that we are very intentional in the solutions that we are providing to the customer. So that is one. The other thing is also ensuring that we have risk mitigation measures integrated within the entire system. So we find most of the institutions, even the ones that are becoming intentional or they are transitioning to become intentional, they don't have the right tools within there. So the first step is to have the knowledge, and then we move to develop the relevant tools. The relevant tools being the frameworks that they can use to assess the risk, and also the response, preparing for response through the relevant tools, like Callum was speaking about, having the right product that ensures the customers get the final or the right solution out of it.
Thank you so much, Justice. So awareness, knowledge, these are critical themes here, and I'm just wondering, Joanna, as the climate scientist, you have the most knowledge out of all of us, but you're working with regulators and policymakers through AFI, and I just wanted to know how that stakeholder group is thinking about these risks. What are they doing to address some of these knowledge issues and incentive issues among the FSPs? If you can just talk a little bit more about what AFI is doing and what you're seeing among your membership.
Yes, thank you so much, Mayara. It's really a true pleasure to be a part of this discussion, and it's such a timely discussion as well, considering the COP26 ongoing right now. I'm also very happy to be introduced as the only climate scientist in the panel. Indeed, my days researching the Siberian tundra, they are over, at least for now, and I'm working with the Alliance for Financial Inclusion. So we're a network of 100 central banks and other financial regulators from 89 different countries, all of them in developing and emerging economies, and we work with advancing financial inclusion. So indeed, we work with what we call inclusive green finance. And just to give you a little bit of a background, the issues of climate-related risks to the financial systems, they have been discussed for quite a long time already among central bankers. Within the AFI network, this discussion started already 2015, where there was a realization amongst the central banks that climate change will have negative impacts on financial stability, but even more so, the vulnerable groups, low-income people, they will be the most severely affected by the impacts of climate change. And also climate change would be reversing a lot of the progress made in the last 10, 15, 20 years when it comes to financial inclusion. So it's a question of financial stability, in some cases even price stability. And also, if you look at it in the long run, it might even be a question of security, and climate change can, at worst, lead to forced migration and even conflict. So it's a very big package in there, and there's a quite strong realization amongst central bankers that this is something that needs to be tackled. At the same time, when discussing the risks related to climate change, there was a realization that financial inclusion can be the other side of the coin. Because as we've heard from Justice and Callum, access to financial services, it can really be a way to build resilience against the impacts of climate change, and in some cases, even reduce negative impacts on the environment. And you're absolutely right, Mayara, in what you mentioned earlier. Low-income populations in emerging developing economies are not the massive greenhouse gas emitters, but still it's a question of transitioning across all different sectors and all different people, and ensuring that we don't have a negative impact on the environment. So to be short, access to formal savings, access to credit, insurance and payment systems, they can play a very important role in the resilience building and in the climate mitigation, both for individuals and for MSMEs. So that was the realization. And just to give you a couple of examples to kind of go across the whole spectrum. So having access to formal savings, it can help you rebuild after natural disasters. Having access to specific or general credit, it can enable investments into crops that are more climate resilient. Or crop insurance, it can be a question of life or death when there are unexpected droughts, floods, or storms. We've heard earlier on also other examples, and I think this is an important realization in itself. But of course, what we work with is central banks, financial regulators. So it's not enough to say, okay, this is important, but the question is, what can the central banks and financial regulators do? How can a framework look like, and what kind of policies can be implemented? And also what was discussed with Justice earlier, who needs to nudge? And I think regulators have an extremely important role in nudging the FSPs, in providing the knowledge, in being part of that conversation. So since 2015, we started working on this with the Alliance for Financial Inclusion, and the first thing we did is we developed a policy framework. So we classified different types of policy interventions into promotion policies, provision policies, protection and prevention policies. And these are indeed quite technical central banking policies that are in place. I can share more examples later, but this is just the way we look at it, and I'm more than happy to share more about that later as well. And then my last point on kind of the broad inclusive green finance is green finance is a very broad topic, and what we focus on is inclusive green finance. It's the inclusive elements of green finance, how those that are the most vulnerable in the most vulnerable countries can have access to financial services, and through that adapt, build their own resilience, enable their own mitigation, and be a part of a just transition to a low carbon society. So this is maybe where, Mayara, I slightly disagree with calling it greening inclusive finance. We call it deliberately inclusive green finance. It is one subsector of green finance that hasn't been so much explored yet. And I think it needs to be a part of the broader green finance discussion because this focuses, as you said rightly, on the most vulnerable segments of the populations in the most vulnerable countries. And this far, there's been so much said about large-scale mitigation and large-scale adaptation, and a lot of the conversations are led by developing countries, by the EU, by the US, by the UK, etc. And we see this at COP26 as well. And it's so important to really also tackle climate change from a vulnerability perspective, from those countries' perspective that are the most vulnerable and from the populations that will be the most impacted by climate change. And that's why we see inclusive green finance also as a part of the green finance package. So that's more on the broad framework around inclusive green finance and what we do with the Alliance for Financial Inclusion. Thanks.
No, it's great. And we've already got one question actually very linked to what you just said, which is this audience member is basically saying that they see green finance, the bigger form of green finance, so they're not seeing that inclusive side of things. How do you get regulators and central banks in general, financial sector regulators, to think about the inclusive side? And then specifically, if you could give us some examples of, what are some of the carrots and sticks that they're using to change the incentives in the financial system?
No, thank you. And how to get regulators to think about it. I think it comes very organically when discussing with regulators in the network. They are tasked with thinking about the long-term price and financial stability. In some cases, even a part of their mandate is a development mandate, but usually financial and price stability. And when you look at climate change, it's a massive risk to both financial stability, but also price stability. And it's not only a question of the kind of the physical impacts of climate change, but also the transition risks linked to climate policies. And how do you get regulators think about inclusive elements of all of this? For many of our member institutions and countries, it's very clear because the most vulnerable populations, if they are further excluded and if their vulnerabilities are further exacerbated by climate change, if they don't have a safety net, if they don't have resilience against the impacts of climate change, then it's an even greater stability risk on the country level. As I said earlier, it can lead to displacement, involuntary displacement by people because they cannot provide for themselves anymore, or because they're displaced because of natural disasters. It can lead to conflict on a micro level and in a regional level. We even see some cases of transporter conflicts because of linked to climate change. So this is really why the inclusive element is so very, very important when we talk about green finance as well. And to share a couple of concrete examples, a lot of the members in the AFI network are putting in place national level strategies. So green finance strategies that includes an inclusive element, or national financial inclusion strategies that includes a green component, like a very recent national financial inclusion strategy from the Central Bank of Sao Tome and Principe that has a very strong pillar on green finance, just as one example. But if we look at the very concrete policy interventions that maybe are more interesting to the audiences here today, I'll share a couple of examples. For example, the Central Bank of Egypt provides a discounted rate for loans to on-lend to local bakeries to change their ovens to be run on natural gas, as well as a similar program to invest in irrigation systems for climate-smart agriculture. Bangladesh Bank approaches it from a slightly different perspective. They have a 5% green lending target for all commercial lendings from banks in the country. And to support that, they also established a list of what is green, 52 projects that are considered green in the Bangladesh context. The Bank of Ghana, they've been a part of putting in place an incentive-based risk-sharing system for agricultural lending called Girsal. And this is to increase the total amount of credit available to the agriculture and agribusiness sector. And the main objective of Girsal is to de-risk lending to the agriculture and agribusiness sector, a climate-sensitive sector, through credit guarantee instruments. In Nepal, we see refinancing facilities both for reconstruction after natural disasters, but also to offer subsidized loans from green technologies. In Fiji and the Philippines, we see really innovative policies and different systems put in place for reconstruction and recovery after natural disasters. For example, in Fiji, we have the Natural Disaster Rehabilitation Facility, a climate resilience and adaptation program to replace damage inventory, cover the loss of sales, including working capital, repair or replace damaged plants, etc., to recover after natural disasters. And a different type of policy, and this is the last one I will share, is from the Central Bank of Paraguay that put in place ESRM guidelines, so environmental and social risk management guidelines, which is a type of guideline used whenever there's a credit decision made to ensure that no credit will be going into activities or projects that further has a negative environmental or negative social impacts on the society. So these are some of the concrete policies we see, and I'm really happy to see that it's a quite high speed in new policies coming into place and a really high interest from regulators to work on this topic. Of course, as you said earlier, Justice, it's a question of capacity, of knowing what are the risks, what are the policies, how to go about it. But I'm really happy to see that there's a great interest to learn more and to start developing policies from a majority of the AFI members. So yeah, I hope that Mayada answers some of your questions on the concrete policies. Thank you.
No, it's fabulous. Thank you so much. And I know that there are several AFI publications, and hopefully my colleagues can link in the chat about some of these that can give people much more detail around what you're finding. But Joanna, I wanted to give you a chance because I know when we were prepping, you had a question for Callum, and I think it's about time to bring Callum back into this conversation. I'm going to hand it over to you to ask your question.
Yes, thank you so much, Mayada. You know, Callum, because I was just wondering from your perspective, how you look at the demand side of all of this, because we, of course, work with regulators, and there's sort of discussions on how to ensure that there is credit, for example, green credits made available. But once we are there and there is this possibility, do you think the demand will follow, or how do you see the situation from the research you did in Rwanda specifically?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I guess because it could be easy to assume that just because this is a good thing, we only need to sort out the financing and the design and the delivery of these solutions. Not that that's a small part of it, but if we can do that, we've cracked it, and we can grow these solutions to scale. But I don't think that's the case. For opportunity, there are two demand side questions that we feel we need to consider: demand from the clients, and also demand from our partners, our microfinance partners. And in both cases, I don't have a definitive answer to the question, is the demand there? At the client level, we're just starting to better understand need with respect to climate risks. From the research in Rwanda, clients are looking for support. They're looking for services that can help them better manage the climate risks that I talked about earlier. But for the most vulnerable, capacity to pay for these services is likely less than what we've seen for mainstream microfinance services. And we've already seen, in the insurance market, it can be a challenge to develop viable products for which clients are willing and able to pay, even though, theoretically, those products should be helping build resilience. And at the partner level, it's also still largely an unanswered question. As a network, we're only learning ourselves about the role our partners can play and what opportunities there are for us to work with our partners on solutions. And the level of engagement across our network of partners varies. So, just as mentioned, intentional and unintentional institutions in regard to climate change. We certainly have partners who are very intentional. We do have partners who already offer clean energy products. One of our partners in India has already reached scale with a clean energy product, and they've provided loans for that purpose to over 500,000 clients. That program is actually financially viable, both through the payments from the clients and because they're able to claim carbon credits for offsetting carbon emissions. So that's a good example of where a partner has been able to reach scale, and there is demand from the clients for the product. But for most of our partners, this is an unexplored space. The last poll that we had there showed 60% of the audience feel they're not prepared, and 40% are somewhat prepared. No one's very prepared. So I think we're all, to some extent, in the same boat. And another thing to note is, as Mayada, as you said, this isn't just a product. We're not just looking for a simple add-on to what we're already doing. And I think also in that respect, I don't think we should restrict ourselves only to thinking about solutions that are profitable or financially sustainable. That obviously is the history of microfinance, is moving products as quickly as possible to being financially sustainable. But that might not be viable for some innovative solutions in the short term or even in the longer term. And I'm thinking of things like providing weather information and training, supporting development of cooperatives, as well as more innovative financial products. And I do think some valuable forms of support will not be commercially viable. And I think there's a role for grant funding to support those products that could build client resilience. Actually, that's to be an obstacle. In fact, we hear that one of the biggest problems in climate finance is ensuring that existing climate finance funds reach people at a local level. And the financial inclusion sector has built up a network that reaches 130 million households, and I think could be a platform for funneling climate finance to those who are currently underserved. But I think that the question we have to answer, or at least it would be for the financial inclusion sector, and probably many of the stakeholders on attending Financial Inclusion Week this week, to put forward engaging models for investors to justify that funding. So plenty for us still to explore around the demand side too.
Yeah, so Callum, you raised something really interesting, and it actually ties into one of the questions we just got, which is you feel that there's a role for subsidy here. And one of the questions that we just got was that, are there examples of mechanisms where the money is being distributed for people who are prone to climate disasters before a disaster actually happens? So I'm guessing this is some kind of disaster risk, maybe insurance or something of that nature. But I don't know if anyone in the panel has some thoughts on this, whether you've seen anything like this on the ground.
I think right now we don't have much of that solution that can be done. I mean, we have seen with the major rescue institutions like IRC and so on having already a fund that is set up just in case of emergency. But looking at the level of the people that we are targeting, the early warning signs, I mean, the early warning signals is what is being developed in most countries, and linking it, and as I think there are three factors we need to look at it. First of all is identification of beneficiary, which is usually the exclusion inclusion kind of a thing to ensure that you target the right people. It's being missed, and this is linked to either, if you look at most of the country, the registry, the identity is an issue. In a country where the digital identity is well developed, it becomes easy to even identify well in advance. We have so many households who are likely to face mudslide or a mountain is about to erupt in a certain area well in advance. So if digital identity, as we go on, and we have seen a lot of countries now in sub-Saharan Africa moving towards that direction. If digital identity is done, identification of target beneficiaries is one of the factors. And the second thing now would be the early warning signals within the country, ensuring different departments of government and private institutions speak to each other, then they are able to alert in advance, and then the fund can be put in place before the actual disaster happens, and then the money can be distributed. But it's a work in progress in most of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa.
Thank you, Justice. Joanna, I think you probably have some thoughts on this as well.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing. I mean, I definitely agree with this question. It's so important because we want to build the resilience of the most vulnerable populations before there are the impacts of climate change. I think the good part right now is we have quite an okay knowledge of how climate change will look in different parts of the world, in different regions of the countries. And with the proper investments into this type of data gathering, as well as climate projections, we do know which areas are the most vulnerable to the most critical climate impacts, like rising sea levels, like different types of natural disasters, or heat waves, or floods, or melting permafrost, for example. So by knowing the climate impacts in a country, we could overlay that with knowing the vulnerabilities as well. So to try to map out what the vulnerabilities are on a quite granular level, and then design specific products and services that could actually build the resilience. So just as an example, to have access to the proper irrigation systems to withstand increasing droughts, or to have what you need in place to withstand new pests that will be spread because of climate change, or to build houses that will be more storm-proofed or more resilient to different types of winds, for example. So it is a possibility, but what we find all the time when we talk about adaptation and resilience building is the importance of the local communities saying themselves how they want to adapt, how they think they can adapt, and to involve them in the decision making. And I think that's why also it brings a very strong argument for financial inclusion, because financial inclusion is about empowering these individuals to make the decisions needed in order to adapt. So to combine that with the specific technical support, knowledge about the future climate impacts, and then empowering them through financial inclusion to take the needed decisions to adapt for the future, I think that would be really important. And from a regulatory perspective, we already now see a couple of regulators that do some research on this. So specific demand-side surveys asking the individuals and MSMEs how they cope with climate impact, how they would want to cope with climate impact, and what type of financial products and services would be most helpful to them to cope with these impacts in the future. So definitely things are happening. A lot more needs to happen in this space as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joanna. So I have a request of the audience. So we've seen from the responses to the questions that people feel that they have limited knowledge, and that they feel that their institutions or their partners are not as prepared as they should be. So what more do you want to see? What just thinking about the future of Financial Inclusion Week and other kinds of events or knowledge events that you would need to improve your knowledge. In the chat, please just send us as much as any thoughts you have on this topic. So just keep chatting. But then I'm going to turn back, because I know that there was another question that Justice had for Joanna. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Justice.
Thanks, Johanna. So this connects to some of the solutions that you've said, working with the regulators as well. But what we have seen, the struggle that the financial inclusion players are facing right now is because of the investment that is required. As we have said, Callum has rightly mentioned, this might not be a profitable thing, especially for microfinance to some extent, but then they might need also capacity building, a lot of research to be conducted, all that. To what extent is the regulator working together with the financial service provider to ensure that this is done? And as you answered that, I was thinking about the Ghana risk-based index insurance sharing credit guarantee scheme, because following what happened in Nigeria, that's when they built the Ghana one. And in Nigeria, most of the failures came as a result of, if you look at the financial service provider that came on board, they were just larger commercial banks who had no outreach in the rural area. So when such solutions are done, how do you ensure that the regulator ensure that the final, especially the microfinance institution, are brought on board and are prepared to prepare their customers?
No, thank you so much, Justice. I think it's going to be a quite boring answer to this one, but it's really kind of breaking the silos. I think on the very last point you raised, you of course see different contexts in different countries, but also sometimes certain regulators regulating different parts of the financial services provided. So it's really a question of collaboration. It's about spreading the knowledge. What we see a lot with our regulators is that there's also a need to collaborate with new areas that there wouldn't be collaboration with otherwise. So, for example, ministries responsible for climate change or nationally determined contributions, environment ministries and different agencies, meteorological institutions, etc. So there's really a big need to have this collaboration and also to have this dialogue with the FSPs to understand what the situation is and also to build their capacity and also sometimes have their input, because some FSPs are really running ahead and already providing quite interesting green financial products and services. And then for the regulator to be aware of this and to see what works and doesn't. So we see quite a lot of initiatives from regulators where they bring together different stakeholders as well as FSPs to have the first steps of joint capacity building and then coordination. And then after that, putting strategies in place to start implementing. But of course, it looks different in different countries. And there's a lot of discussions ongoing currently about what is green, how do you define green in a specific national context. That's a very complicated question and something we definitely need to address. I think just my very last point linking to the ongoing discussions, COP26 in Glasgow, one of the main points being discussed is climate finance. There's a pledge from developed countries of 100 billion per year for climate finance for the most vulnerable countries. And this seems, after a couple of days, that there is some progress on this. At least there's a lot of discussions. And here it's so important that there are inclusive green finance strategies in place on the national level, or at least systems, how to channel that climate finance all the way to those that need it the most. And I think here, national level coordination, capacity building, and also collective changing of mindset is so important and something we see amongst quite a number of regulators trying to advance this as well.
Okay, so we are getting very, very close to the end, and we all of a sudden got a bunch of questions. So I'm going to ask you to do two things. In about 45 seconds, I want you to prepare, what is your call to action, and to whom do you want to send this call to action? But then if you can also weave in some of the responses to one of these questions that came in. So for example, one of the questions is how to get those who are blind to the issues of financial inclusion and diversity and equity issues to open their eyes to the problems and challenges. Another one to you, Justice, so maybe you could think about this one, is what are other organizations that provide technical assistance to financial services providers and social enterprises looking to address climate change risks? And then the last question is really around between the regulators and the end customers, what about the agent networks or small MFIs, ROSCAs, self-help groups? How should they be involved and covered? So in your kind of final call to action, see if you can weave in a response. I'll start with Callum.
Thanks, Miyata. I mean, I'll keep it simple and sort of based around the journey we're looking to go on. So for our stakeholders, microfinance institutions, first off, I would say the first call to action would be to try to better understand the climate risks in your organization. How does the changing climate threaten your clients and your portfolio? What are the risks to your organization? Secondly, trying to understand the opportunities, and that's both thinking about how could you tweak existing services so that they do help clients in times of crisis, and what additional services could be provided to clients aside from the existing financial services, and also who's excluded, who are you not reaching, and particularly where those are some of the most vulnerable communities, is there more that you could do to reach those people. And then thirdly, you know, and this goes to, I think one thing we've discovered in this session is we're all on this journey. You know, none of us have solutions to the main questions that we've raised today. So, you know, be part of a learning community around this. You know, we are one of the first things that we did with our climate strategy was to join the principles for locally led adaptation, and that wasn't because, you know, we felt that we had a lot of experience to speak into that group, but more because, you know, we feel we want to learn from others in the development sector, including beyond financial inclusion, about how to listen to clients, to listen to the people that we are trying to serve, and to understand local needs in terms of climate risks. So being part of those communities, you know, even beyond the financial inclusion sector, you know, I think is really critical.
Thank you, Callum. I know we've hit the time limit, but just, you know, a few seconds for each of the other panelists. Joanna and Justice.
Thanks. Let me pick it from where Karama stopped. So I'm looking at it as a partnership approach. We need to do partnership, ensure that we have relevant knowledge within these institutions, work closely together with the regulators to ensure that we push forward. And for the small institution, like one of the panelists is asking about the ROSCAs, the VSLAs, how they can be involved. They are really important agents of change, or agent of reaching the last mile. So they can be all involved, being in one platform and being able to access the climate funding that is either available through the central bank or through the international organization. The same organization, they package the funding plus the technical assistance, which people like Microsoft and other people also provide over and above the research institutions that are there.
Yes, and very shortly from my side, stop thinking it's complicated. It's a reality we're up against, and it's definitely something we can learn and we can tackle together. So that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanna. Beautiful closing words. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, panelists, for joining, and thanks to everyone in the audience. Have a great rest of Financial Inclusion Week.